What if the world you remember is only one thin skin over many others? And every so often, at certain edges, those skins rub together and something slips through. My name is Ray. I spend most of my life collecting stories that sit just outside the frame. The photograph that refuses to fit the family album. The station platform that remembers a train that never appears on any timetable. The attic box that contains an object no one in the house can explain. These are not always dramatic spectacles. More often they are small misfits, misaligned pieces of a life. Yet when enough of them converge, they begin to suggest something larger, a seam in the world where one thread peels away from another. This series is about those seams. Tonight we begin with a piece of folklore that became an investigation, the so-called Silent Train of Warsaw. We'll move from there into cases with harder traces, photographs, laboratory tests, and into first-person accounts of waking into a life that feels almost like yours but is not. Along the way, we'll ask cautious questions and listen closely to the people left holding evidence that refuses easy explanation. Imagine an empty platform at night. The station lights hum. You smell cold metal and a faint oil tang, the ordinary background of railways. Then something else. A distant mechanical breathing, the soft clack of wheels not yet visible. A carriage appears at the far end of the platform, its windows darkened, its flanks smeared with a sheen that catches the sodium lights. No conductor steps out. No announcement blares through the speakers. The clock on the wall keeps time. The train pauses, then moves on. Later, you check the day's logs and timetables. Nothing. No record, no schedule. No ticket sales. That's how many of the Silent Train reports begin. Ordinary observation threaded with a detail that doesn't belong. In Warsaw, these reports have been circulating in one form or another since the 1960s. At first, they were whispers. Students who swore they'd seen a late-night passenger car roll silently into the old central station. A night watchman who recorded nothing on his ledger. An old woman who said the train took something from the platform one evening and came back empty. Over decades, the stories persisted and accumulated, like layers of varnish on a wooden plank. Two witnesses are often mentioned together in the local accounts. Marek Klaskowski worked maintenance at one of the suburban yards. He tried, more than once, to capture the train on camera. The earliest attempts predate most modern phones. His footage, when locals later transferred it to digital, reads as if someone smeared the lens with grease. In the moments when the train should be most visible, the film resolves into a gray blur and a smear of motion, as though the camera had been looking through rain that the eye could not see. Irina Kowalska is another name that appears in interviews and municipal records. She is an elderly woman who lives several stops away from the main station. Her story is quieter but raw. She remembers a Saturday in the early 1970s when her grandson failed to come home from school. He had been 12. The police searched extensively. Neighbors knocked on doors into the night. There was, officially, no leads. Irina told reporters years later that on the evening he disappeared, she had seen a train stop at her local station. A single car, lights dimmed, doors silent. Just long enough for a small boy to step down and walk with a man she didn't recognize. When she followed the pair with her eyes, they vanished into the platform shadows and the man seemed to glide away in a direction that led, she said, toward the old river embankment, where no path existed. The police records list the boy as missing. He was never found. Then there is the image that lingers in many retellings. A coat, fresh from a warm body, left draped over a low wall by the tracks. Thomas Masaryk, according to the files and a handful of press recollections, chased a late-night blur he thought was a person trying to slip away. He ran along the platform shouting, then along a service path that followed the tracks. When he paused, breathless, he looked down and found his child's coat, his own coat, as later confirmed, lying on the ballast, still warm to the touch. There were footprints around it, leading to a place where the air itself seemed to thicken, then stop. Thomas told police he felt as if the world had hiccuped. The coat warmed his hands and smelled faintly of the train's oily tang, but no one was there. One of the reasons the Silent Train legend hardened into something more than folklore is the persistence of failed recordings. Marek's early attempts were not alone. Over the years, station surveillance cameras have captured odd frames: a smear of light where a carriage should be, a stretch of platform with a row of empty seats, then a single child sneaker sitting where no child is visible. Those frames, when enhanced by technicians, offer no clean answers, only anomalies, doubled edges, vague reflections that resolve into nothing when magnified. It is as if whatever passes through those moments interferes with the cameras themselves. In the mid-2000s, a group of independent investigators calling themselves Grupa Sparta began a more systematic approach. They installed magnetometers, vibration sensors, and audio recorders at several liminal spots across the older lines, beneath vaults, in disused tunnels, and on platforms where witnesses most frequently reported sightings. Grupa Sparta shared some of their raw data with local journalists. Their seismographs show subtle, low-frequency vibrations that don't match the recorded schedules of trains. Their magnetometers sometimes registered sudden fluctuations for a few seconds, spikes that had no immediate explanation in the station's power logs. A local newspaper ran a piece quoting one of the group's members saying the sensors picked up a passing signature that resembled a heavy metallic object, but lacked the predictable harmonics of locomotion. Take that claim with caution. Grupa Sparta is an amateur collective, and their work has not been peer-reviewed in any formal sense. They were, however, careful with documentation, timestamps, multiple overlapping sensors, independent witnesses on site, and their raw audio files that circulated online include a low metallic hum and a soft, rhythmic thudding that could be mistaken for any number of mechanical sources. Investigators who later examined Grupa Sparta's files noted that some of the spikes matched nights when witnesses reported sightings. That correlation is intriguing, not conclusive. Local theories about the train have always reflected the anxieties of their times. In the 1960s and 70s, some told stories about Cold War experiments, unsanctioned tests of electromagnetic projects, secret carriages used to move equipment with little paper trail. Others saw the train as a ghost of wartime movements, a residue of lives displaced and never returned. Spiritual readings appear as well. Father Adam Bisnevsky, a Jesuit priest who has worked in Warsaw's older neighborhoods, has been quoted in parish newsletters suggesting the train is a place where the worn and the lost cross paths, an image meant to comfort grieving families while refusing literal claims. He frames the phenomenon as a spiritual symbol, a way to speak about placelessness and the sorrow of those whose loved ones disappear into disorder. Father Bisnevsky's interpretation is theological, one of many lenses through which the same events have been viewed. As the stories solidified, they began to attract people with stakes, relatives looking for closure, thrill seekers, investigators, and a handful of scientists willing to examine anomalies. Some proposed electromagnetic interference as a mechanism. Old railways have complex electrical systems, stray currents, and buried cables. Under certain conditions, a strong EM field can cause equipment to misread signals or for sensors to register false positives. Others lean toward psychological explanations, shared expectation, and the brain's propensity to patternize. When a community carries a collective narrative, they will often find confirmations for it. That is how myths can persist. Still, explanations that rely solely on fraud or misperception struggle to account for certain repeats: the warm coat, the corroborated sensor spikes, the consistent locations of sightings clustered around liminal places, stations, attics, tunnels, geodesic points where old maps and new construction meet. Liminal spaces matter in these stories because they are thresholds, places designed to shepherd movement, and in a metaphorical sense, designed to hold transits. People report that the train seems most likely to be noticed in the dusky hour, when caretakers are alone and light is thin, at stops where old lines meet newer ones. Those are the edges where something feels different, as if reality vibrates more and the confidence of memory loosens. Before we move on, a brief content warning. The next section includes descriptions of disappearances and the emotional impact on families. including references to missing persons and severe distress. If those themes are difficult for you, consider pausing here. When investigators probed official archives, they found a curious pattern. Missing person reports clustered in similar time frames and places, but with no clear cause. Police files from different decades sometimes showed the same case numbers resurfacing in later lists or reports cross-referencing each other. Some families described an unspoken rule: don't talk about what you saw and hope it would go away. Others, like Irina, could not let the silence remain. The silent train did something else. It expanded the vocabulary of loss. For some, it became a way to narrate absence. For others, it suggested a more dangerous possibility. The train didn't just ferry memories and objects, perhaps it carried people, or carried them away. Those who suspected such a thing were often treated with skepticism, sometimes compassion, more often a mixture of both. The line between grief and credulity blurred. Asking questions became a way to insist the missing person had not simply vanished into paperwork. Which brings me to Marek again. He kept trying to film because he thought if he could make the anomaly legible, to lenses, to police, to journalists, then the missing might be traced. He was not an inveterate believer. He was a worker, used to taking stock and making repairs. But his footage resisted interpretation. In a recorded interview later in life, he said the most unnerving moment was not when he saw the blurred carriage, but the silence it carried. No coupling clank, no hiss of braking. Just a presence that seemed to mute the station's ordinary background noise for a few seconds. Marek's hands trembled when he described reaching down to pick up the camera and finding the film still soft with warmth from his palms, as if the moment they had recorded had altered the touch of the film itself. Skeptics will point out that warm film, blurry frames, and the testimony of people with long memories do not equal interdimensional travel. They are right. But the historical record shows an entanglement of sensory claims and material traces, coats, records, sensor spikes, that demand explanation. It's one thing to say community memory shapes perception. It's another to reconcile physical artifacts that do not neatly conform to the expected narrative. And the more I looked, the more I saw the same pattern elsewhere. Small evidence that seemed to contradict itself. People who remembered differently than official records. Objects that time seemed to have misplaced. That pattern is what pulled me from Warsaw's platforms to an attic in a quiet American suburb, where a different kind of misfit waited in dust and shadow. David Emerson was, by all accounts, an ordinary man, with a steadiness that made neighbors describe him as reliable. He worked in graphic design. He loved family snapshots, collecting spare negatives and old camera equipment the way some people collect stamps. After his father died, David spent a weekend sorting through an attic his mother could not bear to clear. That's when he found the photograph. The photograph was unremarkable at first glance. A family portrait, low light, the soft focus of an amateur camera. What stopped David mid-step was the date penciled on the back, 3 years after the father's recorded death. The man in the picture was unmistakable to the Emerson family. The same jawline, the same tucked-in pocket square, a crease the family all attributed to age. But according to official death records and the obituary that had been printed, the father had been gone years earlier. David did what many of us might do. He assumed a mistake. He took the negative to a lab to have it examined. The lab, an independent facility that handles film authentication, ran a series of tests. They looked at chemical composition, emulsion layers, and the aging of the silver nitrate. They compared handwriting on the back to known samples. The report David emailed me was clinical and careful. The negative's chemical profile matched the era claimed. The handwriting matched the family's script samples. There were no signs of obvious tampering under forensic magnification. In short, the negative appeared authentic as a physical object, and its date did not align with the recorded life story of the man in it. It is important to underline that a lab confirming the physical authenticity of a negative does not confirm the content of the photograph as a window into another reality. Photographs can be staged, mislabeled, or misremembered. But for David, the photograph had an additional weight. It catalyzed a string of memories and mismatches he could not explain. Simple things began to look wrong. A bicycle David remembered as blue in childhood photographs was, in every family album, red. Favorite toys cited in dinner table stories seemed absent from the pictures. An old neighbor swore David's mother had once kept a certain ceramic figurine on a mantel, an item David had never seen in the house but later found photographed in a family snapshot taken after his father's death. These are small cognitive dissonances on their own. Together they pressured at the seams of David's certainty about his past. He returned to the attic. Beneath a stack of sketchbooks he found a second copy of the photograph, tucked into a long sealed box. That discovery made him think someone in the house had hidden this evidence. He began asking questions. His mother, already frayed by grief and age, grew defensive and confused. There were calls, threatening, at first subtle, later blunt. On his social posts, David wrote a careful description of what he had found, attaching a scanned portion of the negative, and asking if anyone else had seen similar anomalies. The post drew a small online community, a handful of photographers who doubted anyone could fake a chemical negative, a couple of skeptics who admonished him for sensationalism, and a few strangers who sent messages saying simply, "I know," and nothing else. As David pushed, family dynamics shifted. His mother stopped answering some phone calls. She mislaid things she had kept for decades. At one point, she told a neighbor she felt as if the house had shrunk around her memories. "The walls are the same," she said, "but the names of the rooms have moved." That phrasing, poetic, disturbed, made the rounds among the few who were aware of the case. It is crucial to treat that language with empathy. Dislocation can present as confusion, and confusion breeds fear. Before David posted publicly, he had tried to be rational. He consulted an independent archivist who suggested the negative could have been misdated or cross-labeled when someone reorganized boxes. He took a high-resolution scan of the negative to a friend who taught photographic history at a small college. The professor advised caution, but pronounced the emulsion consistent with mid-20th century processes. None of these expert opinions constructed a clear narrative. They only complicated it. I spoke with someone close to David who asked to remain anonymous. They described David as quietly obsessive in the weeks that followed the lab report. He spent late nights combing through family albums and emailing distant relatives. He cataloged discrepancies like a collector cataloging specimens. He found, in a sealed drawer, a crumpled receipt with a date that could have placed his father alive later than the records suggested. At around that time, he also received anonymous phone calls, silences and static. For someone used to translating images into meaning, facts had become slippery. This much, in David's case, is verified by records and by multiple people close to the family. The photograph, the lab report verifying the negative's physical authenticity, the escalation of David's inquiries, and the increasing distress of his mother. What happened after that diverges into contested territory. Reports of threatening calls, an anonymous envelope containing a second copy of the same photograph, and an increasingly public online campaign David mounted to ask for help. Eventually, according to scattered accounts and an archived personal blog that disappears from some server snapshots, David posted a public video in which he said, plainly, that he had found something that changed his sense of what had been real. The video, like much of his other material, circulated among amateurs and curiosity seekers. It was not picked up by major news outlets. I want to be clear. None of this proves the existence of parallel worlds. What it does offer is a human story of someone who encountered a material object that contradicted his narrative and then watched reality warp around that contradiction. The psychological toll of that is not an abstraction. Families fracture. People retrench in denial or double down in pursuit. Obsession can lead to sleep deprivation, to strained relationships, to risky behaviors. I am careful here because these consequences are not merely dramatic beats for a story. They are the lived aftermath for the people involved. There is another layer to David's discovery that pushed it beyond the personal and into the domain of investigators. A second individual, a researcher who had interviewed David's mother in the months after the initial attic find, reported seeing other anomalies in the family's possessions. Small objects that should have been in the Smithsonian of memory were absent. Photographs showed items that current householders could not place. An anthropologist I spoke to, whose work focuses on material culture, pointed out how fragile the link is between objects and memory. We attach meaning to items and then use those items as anchors for stories. When the anchors move, the story tilts, and people can feel unmoored. When David's case shifted toward public curiosity, he attracted attention from outside the immediate family. Online forums obsessed with time slips, a handful of independent journalists, and even one physicist, Dr. Harold Stein, whose name appears in notes David kept. Dr. Stein is not a celebrity scientist. He is a university researcher who specializes in complex systems and has written accessible essays about how small perturbations in a system can create large-scale emergent effects. He agreed to consult informally and told David that while he could not endorse claims of alternate realities, he found the catalog of mismatches interesting. Systems can carry memory in unexpected ways, Stein reportedly said in an email David printed out. Artifacts can appear out of sync if the processes that archive them have been tampered with, or if corruption in storage creates anachronistic signals. We should first exhaust mundane mechanisms before entertaining more exotic ones. That caution is worth noting. Even those willing to look at anomalous data approach it through conservative frameworks. And yet some of the data resisted mundane explanations. The second copy of the photograph meant someone else had taken or retained an image and then kept it hidden. Where that action led is part of the story I will return to, but not yet. For now, of the strands I describe, the healthiest conclusion is this. Physical evidence that appears authentic can produce a crisis when it contradicts recorded reality, and crisis opens pathways for a variety of explanations: technical, psychological, spiritual. We are at the edge of two kinds of inquiry. One is forensic. Track every paper, examine every negative, test materials, cross-reference dates and receipts, interview every witness under careful conditions. The other is existential. How do people cope when the ground of their memory shifts? Many of the people who whisper about trains and photographs are not seeking metaphysical confirmation. They are seeking a way to make the world coherent again. At this stage of my own investigation, I found it useful to step back and consider patterns. The Silent Train and the Emerson photograph do not look identical, but they share motifs, liminal locations where transit happens, material objects that seem to conflict with recorded facts, witnesses who suffer reputational risk when they speak, and small technical traces, blurry frames, anomalous sensor spikes, authentic negatives, that create a knot of evidence hard to untangle. Before I followed David farther down his thread, I wanted to hear from someone who had lived through an experience that felt like stepping into a nearly identical but different life. That is where Eleni's account becomes crucial. Her story is personal in a way the others are not. She speaks from within the moment of return. But to tell Eleni's story properly, I need to pause here. Because the pattern we've built so far, train, negative, sensor, is about physical objects and traces. Eleni's is a psychological and domestic rupture, waking and not being recognized by your own city. If the Silent Train suggested a vehicle that might carry people across seams and David's photograph hinted that objects might cross, Eleni's story asks what happens when the seam snaps someone out of a life and leaves them stranded in a version of things that looks familiar, but is not. It is a story I approached with caution, mindful of the human cost and the temptation to dramatize. I will take up her account next, and with it, we'll meet more researchers, more counter-arguments, and a set of questions that pull at the edges of what science and testimony can explain. But before we reach Eleni, a brief note for anyone following these accounts. If these topics resonate personally, if you have experienced sudden dislocation, ongoing grief, or intrusive doubts about your memories, consider seeking support from trusted friends, family, or a mental health professional. The stories I tell are investigations. They are not instructions. Do not attempt to recreate hazardous situations or to pursue evidence in ways that jeopardize your safety. If this kind of careful, deep mystery exploration interests you, consider liking and subscribing. I'll be bringing more cases like these, interviews, and documented materials that allow you to weigh the evidence yourself. Now, Eleni's story begins on a routine trip. It is a night of ordinary travel, late ferry crossing, a bus, the shore lights blinking, and it ends with the feeling that her city has learned a different language. When we pick up her account, we will move from physical traces into the fragile interior of identity. Eleni's trip began, by all accounts, like any small journey the rest of us take without thinking twice. A late ferry, 2 buses, the low-lived thrum of engines, the shoreline lights like a string of distant lanterns. She had been gone for less than a week, visiting relatives, buying a few things, taking the kind of errands that make up the invisible scaffolding of ordinary life. When she returned to her city, she expected the small rituals that mark homecoming. The attendant at the corner store who knows your order, the neighbor who calls your name, paperwork that lists your address when you go about everyday business. Instead, she encountered a silence that felt architectural, as if the city had been quietly edited while she was away. At the bus stop, a woman frowned at her and asked politely if she was lost. At the block office, the clerk scanned a file, then looked up uncertainly. "We don't have that name," the clerk said, as if reading a line from a script. Eleni presented documents, an ID, a signed lease, the same insurance cards she'd used for years. The machines accepted the barcodes, the stamps verified dates, but the human eyes across the desk kept returning to a puzzle she could not make sense of. The paper trail was thin in ways that simple clerical error did not explain. I do not retell Eleni's words as proof of a metaphysical shift. I recount them because they show how the experience felt to a person waking into a world that remembered her as if she had been marginal, peripheral, or unmade. In her own account, she emphasized small things that made the wrongness accumulative. A neighbor's child who called her by the wrong name for a week. A photograph on a cafe wall that showed a different woman where Eleni's picture used to hang. A calendar card with a notation she did not recognize. Those differences were tiny, discreet, and by themselves might have been shrugged off. Together they pressured at her confidence. Eleni kept a notebook. That habit is common among people who find their reality slipping. The notebook becomes a ledger, a defense against losing track of what was. On the second morning after her return, she found a note, pressed under her front door, written in a hand she knew but which spelled her name with a slight error. The note read vaguely, "If you think you're who you say you are, come to the old pier tonight." She did not go. She told me she wanted to be cautious. She wanted evidence that the little erasures were not simply bureaucratic snafus. The first clear rupture came when she visited relatives who had always acknowledged her as kin. In one house, she opened the door, and a woman she thought was her sister blinked at her as though seeing a stranger. There was a pause, an awkward social tilt, and then a soft, careful set of questions, the kind people use with someone who has lost their way. "Who are you looking for?" the woman asked. Eleni produced photographs, names, dates. The woman kept the pictures in her hands as if turning the weight of them might reveal something invisible. Eventually she folded the photographs and, with tenderness that was also a kind of sorrow, said, "Come back tomorrow. I need to ask my husband." When she did come back the next day, the husband remembered her, but not in the way she needed. "You visited years ago," he said, "but we don't recall you living here." That phrase, "we don't recall you living here," became a refrain in Eleni's telling. Records were inconsistent. A hospital registry that once listed her as a patient in childbirth now showed a different surname for the same time. School files contained a class photograph without her in it. At the post office, the clerk, unable to reconcile their computer with older paperwork, advised filing a formal identity inquiry. Bureaucracy, of course, can be messy. Paper can be lost. Human error happens. Yet Eleni's disorientation felt like being slowly unstitched from a pattern she had not known was sewn into her life. There is one moment she describes that I return to again and again. She was in front of a mirror in her small apartment, running her fingers through her hair, trying to list possessions in her head when she realized a child, no older than 6, was standing in the doorway. The child called her Auntie Eleni and then suddenly asked with the bluntness that children have, "Why do your eyes look like the sea tonight?" Eleni had not noticed anything different about herself, but later in the day she found a small crescent-shaped birthmark at the corner of her left eye. Something she had never had before. Something a child noticed without fanfare. Small details like the birthmark complicate a tidy reading of events. Had the mark been there and she simply never noticed? Had memory smoothed it away? Or had she, in moving between moments, crossed into a version of her life where a tiny biological difference existed? When people tell me such stories, I am attentive to how minor alterations create major dislocations. A birthmark is not proof of parallel timelines, nor is it an argument for the supernatural. It is a sensory anchor that becomes troublesome when it does not fit with recollection. For Eleni, the mark was a private signal that something had shifted, even when the outward scaffolding, keys, clothes, the worn hummed pattern of city noise, remained familiar. Her next choice, which she described as born from a stubborn desire not to be sidelined by confusion, was to ride one of the old commuter trains that ran at dusk through the older part of the city. She told me she thought of the train as a ritual of movement. To be seen moving along a recognized path felt stabilizing. On that evening, the carriage was nearly empty. The windows reflected tired faces and the smear of streetlights. As the train left the station, she noticed a brief change in the lighting. An odd, thin band of shadow that passed through the car as if the world had been slightly realigned for a breath. Eleni's language here was careful. She did not claim grand visions. She described what many witnesses to liminal events describe, a momentary desynchronization. The train's cadence did not change, but the air had a different quality. At a small station, the doors opened and a couple climbed in, ordinary passengers with grocery bags. One had a child who glanced at Eleni and smiled in a way that seemed to say, wordlessly, that the child's world recognized hers. For a few minutes she felt anchored. Then at the next stop the train paused longer than expected. A puff of wind moved through the carriage and, in that interval, a faint metallic note struck a chord in the air, resonant and oddly pure. When the doors closed and the train resumed its run, Eleni found herself clutching a leaflet she did not remember taking. On the leaflet was an address she had never seen before, and near the bottom, a single line in her own handwriting saying simply, "Remember to look." She left the train with new questions, and one small comfort. An unexplainable return, however partial, had given her time to breathe. Was she back in her original world? She could not say. She noticed differences. A neighbor's fence painted a different color. A cafe that used to serve a particular pastry, now selling another. These were not earth-shattering changes. They were the sorts of changes neighborhoods make over months and years. Yet when they were read against a backdrop of contradictory records and strangers' forgetfulness, they made the ground feel porous. Eleni's reaction to these displacements illustrates something essential about the human response to anomalous experiences. Some people double down. They fight to prove normality with paperwork and witnesses. Others withdraw, sensing that the social scaffolding that made life legible has been compromised. Many move between the two. Eleni spent months leaning into both strategies. She worked through bureaucratic channels to reconstruct records, keeping copies in triplicate. She regularly met with neighbors and friends to ask gently whether they remembered certain events. She slept little. The psychological cost of perpetual vigilance became evident in the way she described waking with a pulse in her ears, waiting for something to be different. Over time, Eleni collected what she called small verifications. A neighbor who, after consulting an old family album, confirmed having once photographed her at a seaside festival. A registry office that found in a misfiled drawer a birth certificate with a tiny typographical error that corresponded to her original documents. Those recoveries were balm, but they did not resolve the bigger disquiet. If chunks of your life can be misfiled or misremembered, what prevents further slippages? What prevents the erasure of larger things, people, relationships, names? Her story shares anatomy with other cases in this series: liminal movement, partial returns, and tiny material contradictions that breed doubt. It also underscores a larger social truth. The people who survive these experiences do so often by building redundancy into their lives, keeping multiple copies of documents, cultivating social anchors, and documenting the world relentlessly. That redundancy is not a guarantee, it is a strategy. When Eleni's account reached investigators, it attracted the attention of groups already interested in liminal anomalies. Group Asparta, the collective that had been monitoring railways in Warsaw, examined the timestamps of small stations and compared them to the hours Eleni reported being on the train. They found nothing on their public logs to contradict her presence. Their sensors, however, were not active in that part of the country, so their corroboration was limited to methodology rather than data. The point here is modest but important. Independent investigators can sometimes reproduce the rigor of collection, timestamps, overlapping logs, witness statements, even when they cannot replicate the specific conditions or provide a smoking gun result. I spoke with a physicist, Dr. Harold Stein, about cases like Eleni's, Marek's, and David's. Stein has been cautious in his assessments. He refuses to leap to metaphysical conclusions. What he offered me was a way to think about possibilities without pretending to settle them. One way to frame this, he wrote in a careful email, is to consider how information embeds itself in material systems. Memories, photographs, and bureaucratic records are all forms of stored information. Disturbances, whether they be environmental, electronic, or social, can corrupt or misalign that information. He suggested an analogy. Imagine two overlapping transparency films, each with a slightly different drawing. If they move against one another, the composite image shifts in ways that sometimes produce convincing coincidences. That's not another universe, he cautioned, but it is a model that helps explain how conflicting layers of information might produce the sensation of being in the wrong world. That metaphor, films overlapping, has come up repeatedly among scientists and lay investigators because it offers an accessible mental picture for a complicated set of phenomena. It is not proof. It is a thought tool that helps frame testable hypotheses. Can environmental interference produce anomalies in records? Can EM fields alter sensor output and human perception? Are there archival errors that have become systemically amplified? Each of those questions invites mundane investigation before any exotic claims. Another line of thinking is psychological. Memory is not a photograph. It is a reconstruction. Cognitive scientists are clear that recall is constructive, not replayed. When communities share narratives, when a town tells itself that a certain platform is haunted by a silent train, that narrative will act as a lens on perception. A clinical psychologist I consulted explained how social reinforcement can create expectation and then produce perception that aligns with that expectation. Still, she added, expectation alone doesn't account for verifiable material oddities. Warm coats on tracks, lab-confirmed negatives, and sensor spikes require attention beyond purely psychological models. There is a third set of explanations that, while less amenable to laboratory falsification, are part of the cultural conversation, spiritual and symbolic readings. Father Adam Bisnevsky, the Jesuit priest who has worked for decades with grieving families, frames phenomena like the silent train as metaphors, the language by which people explain the unexplainable. He told a parish newsletter, in words I recall from his office, that some events become signs for communities to process loss. For Father Bisnevsky, the emphasis is pastoral. How do we honor grief when official structures fail to provide answers? He offers solace and rituals rather than technical hypotheses. It is an interpretation that sits alongside scientific models, not in lieu of them. The tension among these perspectives, technical, psychological, spiritual, creates the pattern we see in many of these cases. Each supplies plausible pieces, none supplies a complete picture. The evidence is mixed, the testimonies are earnest, and the consequences are real. That last point, the human cost, deserves emphasis. When small anomalies accumulate, people are hurt, families fracture. Irina Kowalska, the woman whose grandson disappeared near a Warsaw platform decades ago, lived with a quiet ache that did not resolve. In interviews, she described bartering with herself over whether to say the words "took him" or "lost him." The choice of words mattered. It shaped how others would treat her grief. For David Emerson, the photograph became a wedge that opened old wounds and created new conflicts. Friends and relatives took sides, some thinking his inquiries reckless, others moved by his persistence. His mother, as I mentioned earlier, retreated into a fog of confusion toward the end of the documented timeline. David's disappearance from public view remains painful for those who knew him. It is also a reminder of how obsession, born of a desire for coherence, can become consuming. There are cases where people vanish in ways that defy ordinary explanation. I have tried to report those instances carefully, to present records and witness accounts without amplifying rumor. The lists of missing persons in regions where liminal stories persist sometimes show odd clusters. But clusters alone are not proof of a mechanism. They are, however, reasons to investigate with compassion and rigor. Across the many testimonies, a pattern emerges about liminal locations. Platforms, attics, tunnels, and abandoned corners of cities are not merely settings. They seem to function as thresholds in the stories people tell. Why those spots? There are practical reasons. Stations are places designed for transit. People enter and exit. Schedules overlap. Light is often poor at specific hours. Attics and basements are repository spaces, physical archives where objects gather over decades. Tunnels and geodesic intersections, where old city maps meet new development, are places of infrastructural complexity. Cables, pipes, and forgotten wiring can create electromagnetic conditions that electronics misread. In short, liminal spaces are complex systems. Complexity breeds anomalies. What would it mean if, even for a moment, that realities could brush against one another? The notion is an ancient one refracted through modern metaphors. It raises unsettling questions about identity and causality. If a person steps into a slightly different strand of reality, what happens to the version they left behind? Do both exist? Does one supplant the other? Those are philosophical and speculative questions more than empirical ones. Still, they shape how people interpret experiences and cope with loss. So where does that leave us? My work is rooted in curiosity framed by restraint. I value rigorous documentation, timestamps, lab reports, corroborated witness statements, and sensor data. I also value the testimonies of people who feel cornered by loss and who attach meaning to events that official channels cannot neatly categorize. The prudent path is to continue collecting data, to improve sensor coverage in the liminal spots where anomalies cluster, and to encourage multidisciplinary study, engineers, historians, psychologists, and theologians, so that phenomena are examined from multiple angles. At the same time, there is a social responsibility to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. Stories of time slips and parallel worlds can attract charlatans and thrill seekers. Public discourse should err on the side of compassion for those affected and skepticism for claims that leap beyond material evidence. If you encounter an odd negative, a missing record, or a strange sensor spike, the appropriate course is documentation and professional consultation, not spectacle. As I close this episode, I return to the question with which we began. What if the world you remember is only one thin skin among many? The evidence I have encountered does not let us answer that question definitively. Instead, the best I can offer is a map of ambiguity, places where material traces, photographs, warm coats, sensor blips, meet testimony, and where the human consequences are undeniable. These are mysteries, not miracles, and certainly not resolved puzzles. If you take nothing else from these accounts, consider this. The fragility of what we call reality is not just an intellectual puzzle. It is a human condition. People like Irina, Marek, David, and Eleni live with the consequences in ways that do not convert neatly into theories. They require our attention, our patience, and our empathy. If this exploration of liminal edges and possible parallel seams interested you, there are more cases to examine. Time slips, accounts of altered cityscapes, and investigations into archival anomalies. Check the linked video on similar cases if you want detailed dossiers and follow-up interviews. And if you want to help us keep looking, subscribe for more careful documented investigations into the mysteries that sit at the margins of our everyday maps. The mysteries of parallel universes, if that is even the best phrase for what we're describing, remain in the end an invitation. Not an invitation to chase, but an invitation to look, to record, and to care. To hold space for uncertainty while we gather the evidence that might one day let us understand why certain places feel thin, and why certain lives seem, for moments, to slip their seams.